A military helicopter landed on the roof of a hospital in the middle of the night. Armed soldiers moved through the hallways. Patients pressed against their room doors. Staff members froze where they stood. The commander walked past every physician in the building, past the chief of surgery, past the department heads, past every person with a title and a white coat, and stopped in front of a woman mopping a hallway spill in worn-out scrubs. He looked at her and said one word, a name nobody in that hospital had ever heard, and the woman, everyone spent 7 months treating like she was invisible, stood up straight, handed the mop to the nurse beside her, and walked into a trauma room that 3 senior doctors had already failed to solve. What happened next would end careers, rewrite hospital policy, and force every person in that building to ask the same question. How do you spend 7 months humiliating someone and never once think to ask who she actually was? Before we get into what happened that night, if this is your first time here, hit that follow button and stay with me until the end of this story. If it moves you, leave a like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing most people noticed about Mara Calloway was that she didn't talk much. Not in the way that people who are shy don't talk. More like the way someone doesn't talk when they've already said everything worth saying in a different life, in a different context, in rooms where words had weight and silence meant something specific. She'd come to Crestfield Regional Medical Center in Dunmore, Pennsylvania in February, transferred from a contract placement agency without much paperwork and with even less explanation. The agency listed her as a general floor nurse with 7 years of clinical experience. Human Resources noted the gap in her employment history. 2 years, almost exactly, and flagged it during intake. Mara told the intake coordinator that she'd taken time off for personal reasons. The coordinator didn't push. People took breaks. It wasn't unusual. What was unusual was Mara herself, though nobody could quite explain why. She moved through the hospital with a kind of economy that didn't fit the environment. Every motion deliberate. Nothing wasted. When a cart rolled too close to a patient room door, she repositioned it without being asked and without making a production of it. When a new resident struggled to find the defibrillator charge setting during a drill, she guided his hands without embarrassing him, then walked away before he could thank her. The older nurses noticed it first, that she never seemed to be in a hurry, but was always where she needed to be. "She's weird," said Joanna Purvis, a third-year RN who'd worked trauma for 6 years and had opinions about everyone. "Not bad weird, just she watches everything." "Probably just nervous," said Dana Fielding, who worked day shift and had known Joanna since nursing school. "New jobs are stressful." Joanna shook her head. "She's not nervous, that's what I mean." Nobody gave it much more thought than that. Crestfield Regional was a busy hospital, a level 2 trauma center serving Dunmore and 3 surrounding counties. And there wasn't time to spend analyzing why a contract nurse moved differently than everyone else. There were patients to see, charts to update, supply orders to argue about, and a growing backlog in the ER that never seemed to get shorter, no matter how many staff got added to the rotation. The person who decided Mara was a problem was Dr. Elliot Voss. Voss was the chief of emergency medicine at Crestfield Regional, and he had been for 9 years. He was not a bad doctor. That was the complicated part. He was technically skilled, genuinely committed to patient outcomes, and capable of making clear decisions under pressure. He was also the kind of man who had spent 20 years in a hierarchy that rewarded certainty over curiosity, and who had stopped questioning his own instincts somewhere around the time he made department chief. He had a way of entering a room that made the air shift slightly, not because he demanded it, but because enough people had deferred to him for long enough that deference had become the room's default. He first noticed Mara 6 weeks after she started, during a trauma intake for a 43-year-old man brought in after a construction accident. The man had multiple lacerations, a possible fractured radius, and what the paramedic report described as disorientation at scene. Voss was on shift and moved to take the lead. Mara was the intake nurse. She was checking the patient's pupils with a pen light when she said, without looking up, "His blood pressure is dropping faster than the lacerations account for." Voss looked at the monitor. "It's within range." "It's trending," Mara said. 72 over the last 4 minutes. That's not consistent with surface trauma. Voss studied the monitor. He didn't see what she was describing. The numbers were technically within acceptable limits. He told her to continue intake protocol and moved to review the paramedic notes. 40 minutes later, the patient crashed. Internal bleeding. A ruptured spleen the initial imaging hadn't caught because the angle had been wrong. They caught it in time, so barely. And the man survived. But when Voss reviewed the sequence afterward, he found himself circling back to the moment in the intake room when a contract nurse had flagged something he'd dismissed. He didn't say anything to Mara. He filed the incident internally as a near miss with a documentation error and moved on. But he watched her after that. 3 weeks later, Mara adjusted a medication dosage for an elderly patient with a complex cardiac history. She didn't wait for orders. She reduced the secondary anticoagulant by 15%. Noted it in the chart with her clinical reasoning, and flagged it for physician review. By the time the attending reviewed it, the patient's morning blood work had already validated her adjustment. The original dosage would have pushed the patient's levels into a dangerous range, given a medication interaction the attending had missed. The attending said nothing. He initialed the adjustment and moved on. Voss was the one who called Mara into his office. "You adjusted a patient's medication without a physician order," he said. Mara sat across from him. She wasn't agitated. She held his gaze without aggression. "I noted it and flagged it for review. The chart reflects the full reasoning. That's not the protocol. The protocol exists to prevent errors. The medication as ordered would have caused an interaction. I documented everything and flagged it immediately." "You're a floor nurse," Voss said. "You don't make unilateral medication changes. That's not your authority." "I kept a patient safe," Mara said. "You crossed a line," Voss said, "and I'm going to make sure you understand that clearly." He put a formal written notice in her file, restricted her from the advanced care rotation, and moved her to general floor coverage on the overnight shift. The notice used words like scope of practice and chain of command and professional boundaries. It was thorough and procedurally correct and completely ignored the fact that the patient she'd helped was discharged without incident, while 2 other patients that week had suffered complications from orders that went unchallenged. Mara read the notice, signed the acknowledgement form, and went back to work. She didn't appeal it. She didn't complain to HR. She didn't go to the nursing union rep or send a message up the administrative chain. She moved to the overnight floor rotation and did her job with the same quiet precision she'd brought to every shift since February. It was Nurse Director Sandra Oakes who felt the decision most acutely. Sandra had been at Crestfield Regional for 16 years, the last 7 in nursing administration, and she had a better read on floor staff than most of the physicians who passed through her department. She'd been watching Mara since week 2, and she had a feeling that none of the written notice or the rotation restriction had landed the way Voss intended. "She's not rattled," Sandra told her deputy director one afternoon. "Most people, you put a formal notice in their file. They either get defensive or they get careful. She just keeps working." "Maybe she doesn't care about the job," the deputy director said. "Maybe she doesn't care about this job," Sandra said, which was a different thing entirely. She tried to pull Mara's full employment history through the agency and hit an unusual number of blocked fields. Not incomplete, blocked. The kind of restricted access you encountered sometimes when someone had a security clearance or had worked in a government contract capacity. Sandra had noted it and set it aside. It wasn't her business, but she hadn't forgotten it. The overnight shifts were quieter, which suited Mara fine. She managed her floor with the same efficiency she'd brought to trauma, caught a sepsis indicator on a post-surgical patient that the outgoing shift had charted as normal fatigue, and escalated it in time for the patient to receive intervention before things turned critical. The attending who responded at 3 a.m. was bleary and initially skeptical, but the patient's labs when they came back made the case for her without any further argument. Word moved through the nursing staff quietly, the kind of reputation that builds not through announcements, but through pattern. This nurse catches things. This nurse is worth paying attention to. The newer nurses started positioning themselves on the same sections of floor as Mara during overnight shifts, not because anyone told them to, but because they'd noticed that when Mara was nearby, things went better. Voss noticed the pattern from a distance and didn't like it. His second formal action against Mara came in late spring, after she intervened during a handoff when she identified what she believed was an erroneous discharge order for a patient with ambiguous imaging results. She didn't block the discharge. She documented her concern in the patient's chart, flagged it for the attending, and requested a secondary review. The attending initially pushed back. The patient was held pending the review. The follow-up imaging found a pulmonary embolism. This time, the patient's family sent a letter to hospital administration. They thanked the staff and specifically mentioned that a night shift nurse had flagged concerns when others had signed off on the discharge. Administration passed the letter to Voss's department for reference. Voss called Mara into his office again. "You went outside the chain of command," he said. "I used the hospital's official documentation system and requested a review through the proper attending," Mara said. "You created a conflict during a handoff." "I documented a clinical concern." "You make the other staff feel second-guessed," Voss said, and his voice had an edge in it now that hadn't been there before. "You make physicians feel like they can't do their jobs without someone looking over their shoulder." "If I'm catching things that could kill someone, I'm going to document them," Mara said. "Every time." "Not anymore," Voss said. The second notice stripped her from any patient safety escalation capacity outside her assigned floor rotation. In practical terms, it meant she could care for patients on her section, but had no formal pathway to flag concerns outside that section without physician co-authorization. It was an unusual restriction. Sandra Oakes questioned it in writing when she saw the paperwork, but Voss had the administrative authority to implement it, and he did. Sandra stopped Mara in the hallway the morning after the second notice was filed. "How are you doing?" she asked. It wasn't a casual question, and they both knew it. "I'm fine," Mara said. "You know what he's doing," Sandra said quietly. "I know what he thinks he's doing," Mara said. Sandra looked at her for a moment. "Is there anything I should know? About you? About your background?" Mara held her gaze. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I'm here to take care of patients." "That's what you are now," Sandra said. "Is that all you've ever been?" Mara didn't answer. She nodded once, thanked Sandra for asking, and walked back toward her floor. Sandra watched her go and had the clear, unshakable feeling that she was looking at someone who was carrying a weight the hospital couldn't measure and didn't understand. The night everything changed was a Thursday in early July. It started the way a lot of crisis nights start. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one individually manageable until suddenly they weren't. The ER was already backed up. A multi-vehicle accident on Route 9 had pushed 3 critical traumas into the department simultaneously, and the evening staff was working at capacity. 2 attending physicians were tied up in surgery. The resident on ER duty, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, was 26 years old, 7 months into his residency, and handling the volume with more composure than most people twice his age would have managed. But he was still a resident, and the department was moving faster than his training had fully prepared him for. Mara was on her overnight floor rotation when the call came through. Not for her. She wasn't in the ER anymore. But she heard the overhead page for additional nursing support to the emergency department, and she heard the specific codes that followed it, and something in the sequence made her stop walking. She stood in the hallway of the 3rd floor and listened. The second page came 30 seconds later. Different code. Same urgency. Mara turned around. She wasn't supposed to be in the ER. Her restriction was clear. She had no authority to pull herself into the emergency department rotation without physician co-authorization. She knew exactly what another protocol violation would mean for her file. Voss would use it, and he'd be within his rights to. She walked to the ER anyway. The department was controlled chaos. Whitfield had 2 of the 3 trauma patients stable and was working the 3rd. A 51-year-old woman with a head injury and deteriorating responsiveness. 2 nurses were managing vitals, and a 3rd was coordinating imaging. It was organized, professional, and slightly behind where it needed to be given how fast the patient's pressure was dropping. Mara moved to the secondary station without being told, pulled the incoming patient's paramedic report, and started reading. A man had arrived 18 minutes ago, presented as a cardiac event. Chest pain, shortness of breath, irregular rhythm. He'd been triaged and placed in Bay 4 with a cardiac workup in progress. The attending who'd initially assessed him had pivoted to the trauma cases when the accident victims arrived, leaving the cardiac patient under monitoring with a standing order for the workup to continue. Mara looked at the cardiac patient's vitals on the monitoring screen. She looked at the paramedic notes again. Then she walked to Bay 4. The man on the gurney was in his late 40s. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't rest. His breathing was shallow and slightly irregular. His face had a quality that emergency nurses learned to recognize. Not pain exactly, but the look of a body rationing its resources. She checked his wrist. His pulse was there, but uneven in a specific way. She looked at his neck and saw what she was looking for. A slight distension in the jugular vein that didn't fit the cardiac presentation on his chart. She moved to his left side and pressed with careful precision along his lower ribs. The patient flinched, minimally. But he flinched. "Sir," she said quietly, "can you hear me?" "Yeah," he said. His voice was steady, too steady for how he looked, the kind of steady that came from training. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," Mara said. "When did this actually start?" The man looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, assessment. "Ask me something else," he said. "Okay," Mara said. "Where's the actual injury?" A pause, then, "Left side. Took something about 4 hours ago. Kept moving." Mara straightened. She turned to the nurse managing the station behind her. "I need a trauma surgeon in Bay 4 right now, not a cardiologist. I need imaging on his left thoracic cavity, and I need someone to call extension 4417 and tell them their package is in Bay 4. The nurse stared at her. "You're not on ER rotation." "I know," Mara said. "Call extension 4417. "I don't even know what extension 4417 is." "Call it," Mara said. "Please." The nurse hesitated for one more second, then picked up the phone. What happened next came from outside the hospital. The sound arrived before any visual confirmation. A low, rhythmic percussion that the staff on the upper floors initially mistook for thunder. By the time people in the ER recognized it as rotor wash, the helicopter was already on the roof. Not a medevac helicopter, not the standard air transport with the hospital's color scheme. This was something else. Dark, angular, running without full exterior lighting. 2 minutes later, the stairwell door at the east end of the ER opened and 4 men walked through it. Not in hospital scrubs, not in civilian clothes. They moved through the department with the kind of control that made people step back without being asked to. The one in front was tall, in his 40s, with close-cut gray hair and the bearing of someone who gave orders in environments where orders mattered. He scanned the department in roughly 2 seconds. His eyes landed on Mara. He crossed the room without looking at anyone else. "Relay," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it was a confirmation. Mara met his eyes. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, not relief. Something older than either of those things. "Commander," she said. Whitfield had stopped working. The nurses had stopped moving. Voss, who had come down from the administrative floor when the helicopter appeared on the roof camera feed, stood in the doorway of the ER and watched a military commander walk past him without acknowledgement to stand in front of a contract night shift nurse. "What's his status?" the commander said. "Internal hemorrhage, left thoracic. I'm guessing penetrating trauma, 4 to 5 hours old. He's been compensating. He won't keep doing it." "What do you need?" "Trauma surgeon, a specific imaging sequence, and everyone else to get out of my way," Mara said. The commander turned to the room. "You heard her," he said, and the room moved. Voss took 1 step forward. "Excuse me. This is my department. Whatever is happening here, you don't have the authority to—" The commander looked at him. It wasn't a hostile look. It was the kind of look that simply acknowledged a person existed and found them to be a non-factor. "Sir," he said, with the precise amount of courtesy that contained no courtesy at all, "your nurse is saving my operative's life. You can have your department back in about 40 minutes. He turned away from Voss before Voss could respond. Mara was already moving toward the trauma bay. She didn't look back. The door closed behind her, and through the small window, the staff who remained in the main area could see her moving, gloved, purposeful, issuing quiet instructions to the trauma surgeon who had arrived, and who was, visibly, taking direction from a woman whose name badge said Calloway M. Night Shift RN. Voss stood in the middle of his emergency department with a formal written notice in Mara Calloway's personnel file and watched the wall clock move. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody looked at him. The room hummed with the sound of a hospital working around a problem it had spent 7 months creating, finally confronting the shape of what it had dismissed. The clock on the ER wall read 11:47 when the trauma bay door finally opened. Mara came out first. She pulled her gloves off with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times in conditions far worse than this, dropped them in the biohazard bin without looking, and stood for a moment with her back to the room. Her shoulders rose once with a slow breath, and then settled. That was the only indication she gave that anything had cost her anything at all. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Renata Sorrell, came out 12 seconds behind her. Sorrell was 51 years old, had been doing trauma surgery at Crestfield Regional for 14 years, and was not easily impressed by other people's clinical decisions. She'd come into Bay 4 ready to take over and had instead spent the last 38 minutes executing a procedure mapped out by a night shift floor nurse with the kind of methodical precision Sorrell usually only encountered in surgeons who'd been doing it for decades. She stood outside the bay door and looked at Mara's back with an expression nobody in the department could quite categorize. The operative, the man from Bay 4, whose name nobody on the Crestfield staff had been given, was alive, stable. Moved to a secure room on the 4th floor under conditions that the commander had arranged with hospital administration in a phone call that lasted approximately 4 minutes, and that Sandra Oakes, who happened to be working late, had been present for. The ER had resumed its normal operation. The 3 trauma patients from the Route 9 accident were all stable. Whitfield was finishing his documentation at a workstation near the east wall, and he kept glancing toward the trauma bay with the look of someone recalibrating something internal. Voss hadn't moved from the spot near the doorway where the commander had left him standing. He was watching Mara. She turned around eventually. She always did. And when she did, she found the department arranged around her in a way that was different from how it had been 2 hours ago. Not dramatically, not performatively, but in the small ways that matter. The nurses who had stepped back from her when the second written notice went into her file were now angled toward her. The resident who'd been managing chaos all night met her eyes when she looked his way, and nodded with something that was close to gratitude. Voss was the only person in the room still arranged against her. She could see that he knew it. She walked to the workstation, pulled up the patient's interim notes, and started typing. Ms. Calloway. She kept typing. Dr. Voss. I need you to explain what just happened. I identified a patient with a penetrating thoracic injury being mischaracterized as a cardiac event. I requested a trauma consult and appropriate imaging. The surgery resolved the hemorrhage. He's stable. You were not authorized to be in this department. I know. You made unilateral clinical decisions again. Mara stopped typing. She turned her chair to face him. She wasn't angry. That was the part that kept throwing people, She never seemed angry, even when she had every reason. It made the evenness of her voice feel like something other than calm, something more load-bearing. A man would have bled out in Bay 4 while the workup looked for a cardiac problem that wasn't there, she said. I could see that from the nursing station. If your concern is about protocol, write it up. You know where my file is. You don't seem to understand the seriousness of... I understand the seriousness, she said, and something shifted in her voice then. Not a rise in volume, but a change in register, like a frequency dropping low enough to feel instead of just hear. I understand it better than most people in this building. I also understand that the man in room 412 is alive right now, and that is the only metric that matters to me. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room, at Sorrell, at Whitfield, at the nurses who had gone carefully still, and understood that he was not going to win whatever this was in a public setting at midnight. We'll discuss this tomorrow, he said. Sure, Mara said and turned back to her documentation. The commander's name was Harlan Deeks. Mara had known him for 11 years, though not under circumstances that appeared in any file accessible to Crestfield Regional's HR department. He found her in the break room at midnight. She was sitting with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, and she looked up when he came through the door with the same expression she'd had when he'd called her relay in the middle of the ER. Not surprise. Something more complicated. Deeks closed the door and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. There was history in the silence, the kind that accumulates between people who have been in bad situations together and survived them and then gone different directions afterward. You look tired, he said finally. I work nights. That's not what I mean. Mara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. How'd you find me? We keep track of assets. I'm not an asset anymore. We keep track of people we don't want to lose track of, Deeks said, which wasn't the same thing, and they both knew it. We had Garrett on a transport, and the cover went soft about 40 miles out. He needed the nearest facility with a trauma bay. This was the nearest facility. Lucky, Mara said. Not luck. His biometrics were flagging for 2 hours before we diverted here. We knew what kind of injury it was. We needed to know if the facility could handle it before we committed. He paused. The duty coordinator pulled your transfer here 8 months ago. That's why we picked this hospital. Mara was quiet for a moment. You used me as a criteria. We used the fact that you were here as a criteria. There's a difference. There really isn't, Harlan. He didn't argue that. He had the decency not to. Instead, he looked at the table between them and seemed to be deciding something. Garrett's going to be moved to a secure facility in about 6 hours. He's stable enough for transport. When that happens, we're done here. He looked up. But I saw what's in your personnel file before I landed. I saw both notices. It's handled. It's not handled. A department chief is building a paper case to terminate a contract nurse who keeps catching things his physicians miss. That's what's happening. I know what's happening. And you're just... what? Letting it happen? I'm doing my job, Mara said. That's all I'm here to do. Deeks leaned back in his chair and studied her with the particular expression of someone who knows a person well enough to know when they're only telling part of the truth. You could come back, he said. Not field work, training, program development. You know what you know, Mara. We don't have a lot of people who know what you know. I left for a reason. I know why you left. Then you know it's not something I can just decide I'm over. He nodded. He didn't push it. That was one of the things about Deeks. He understood when a door was closed, and he didn't rattle the handle. The operative you saved tonight, Garrett, he's 29 years old. He has a daughter. She's 4. He said it without inflection, just information. I'm not saying that to manipulate you. I'm saying it because I think you should know that what you did tonight wasn't abstract. Mara looked at him. It never is, she said. She went back to her floor at 1 a.m. and finished her shift. She changed a wound dressing for a patient in room 318 who couldn't sleep. She sat with a woman in room 324 who was scared about a surgery in the morning and didn't want to be alone. She caught an IV infiltration on a pediatric patient before it progressed and got it sorted out with the minimum amount of fuss that would wake the child's mother. She did her job. She did it the way she always did it, with the same focus and the same economy, and without any indication that the last 3 hours had been anything other than a normal shift. But the hospital was not the same after midnight. Word moved in hospitals the way it always moves, not through announcements, but through the particular velocity of people who need to process things they've witnessed and can't quite explain. By the time the day shift started filtering in at 6 a.m, everyone who worked at Crestfield Regional knew that something had happened. Not the details. The details were still protected by the arrangements Deeks had made with administration, but the outline. A military helicopter, armed personnel, a commander who walked past every physician in the building to stand in front of a night shift floor nurse and call her by a name nobody had heard before. Joanna Purvis heard it from Dana Fielding, who heard it from the ER charge nurse who had been there. Joanna went to find Mara at the end of the shift. She caught her in the locker room, Mara already changed into street clothes, bag over one shoulder. So, Joanna said. Morning, Mara said. I heard what happened last night. Busy night, Mara said. Joanna stared at her. A military commander called you by a code name in the middle of the ER, and you're going with busy night. I don't know what you heard exactly. I heard enough, Joanna said. I heard that you walked into a bay you weren't authorized to be in and diagnosed something 3 other people missed, and that the guy would have been dead in 20 minutes if you hadn't. She paused. I also heard that Voss is already on the phone with the agency this morning. Mara's expression didn't change, but she went still in the specific way that meant she was processing something she hadn't expected. He's moving fast. Sandra's trying to slow it down, but she said he's citing the protocol violations. Both of them, plus last night. He can cite whatever he wants, Mara said. I documented everything. Documentation doesn't matter if the agency pulls your placement, Joanna said. That's how this works. He doesn't have to fire you. He just has to make it easier for the agency to move you somewhere else. Mara shouldered her bag. I know how it works. Does it bother you? Joanna asked, and her voice had lost its usual edge, had gone somewhere more direct. Because it should bother you, what he's doing. It should bother you more than you're showing. Mara looked at her. It bothers me, she said. I just don't have the luxury of showing it to people who work in the same building as him. She walked out. Joanna stood in the empty locker room for a moment and thought about what it would cost a person to measure their reactions that carefully, every single day, in a place that had decided they weren't worth listening to. The call to the placement agency happened at 8:14 in the morning. Sandra Oakes found out about it 20 minutes later through the kind of administrative back channel that department heads didn't know existed and nursing directors cultivated carefully over many years. She sat at her desk and read the summary of what Voss had told the agency and felt something cold and functional move through her. He'd been smart about it. He hadn't said anything that was technically false. He'd described the protocol violations accurately. He'd used the word liability 4 times. He'd noted that the employee in question had been the subject of 2 formal disciplinary actions within 7 months, and that a 3rd incident had occurred the previous evening. He'd framed the whole thing in terms of institutional risk. Nothing he said was a lie. Everything he said was designed to achieve an outcome. Sandra picked up her phone and called her counterpart at the agency, a placement coordinator named Louise Trant, who had been in the business for 20 years and who Sandra had always found to be a straight-line thinker. I heard, Louise said before Sandra could get through a full sentence. What's the agency's position? Officially, we're reviewing the file. A 3rd incident on top of 2 formal notices is a serious pattern. Louise. Unofficially? Something doesn't add up. She's got a file that's been flagged for restricted access since before she came to you. That doesn't happen with regular contract nurses. We've had her for 2 years and she's never had a single complaint from a patient. The only complaints in her file are from physicians whose patients she happened to save. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a complicated place, Louise said. Because, officially, the department chief has standing, and if we don't respond to a formal complaint with some kind of action, we expose ourselves. But I've been doing this long enough to know that sometimes the person doing the complaining is the actual problem. She saved a man's life last night. Military. The helicopter on the roof. A pause. I heard about that. She was the only person in that hospital who caught it. I know, Louise said. That's what makes this ugly. Because Voss isn't wrong about the protocol violations. He's just wrong about what they mean. Sandra looked at the wall across from her desk. There was a framed photo there from a hospital fundraiser 3 years ago. Her and the previous chief of medicine and a bunch of other administrators smiling at a gala dinner. She'd liked the previous chief of medicine. What can you do? She asked. I can slow the review down. Give it a week instead of 48 hours. That gives you time to build whatever case you're building. I'm not sure what case I'm building. Then figure it out fast, Louise said, because Voss filed this morning and he's going to follow up. He's not going to let it sit. Sandra thanked her and hung up. She sat for a moment and then opened Mara Calloway's personnel file on her computer. She went past the formal notices, past the incident reports, past the intake documentation. She went to the original application and the employment history section and looked again at the restricted fields. 2 years, blocked. She pulled up a search interface and typed in the only proper noun she had from the previous night, the extension number that Mara had given the ER nurse, 4417. She'd been curious about it since she heard the story from the charge nurse that morning. The extension didn't exist in the hospital's internal directory. She tried the code name. Relay. Nothing came up on any public search that connected to a person. She sat back in her chair. Then she picked up the phone again and called a number she'd been given 3 years ago by a hospital board member who had connections she'd never fully understood. And she asked the person who answered a single question. Who do I call when I think one of my nurses might have a government background I can't access? The person on the other end of the line was quiet for 4 seconds. Then they told her to hold. Mara slept until 2 in the afternoon, which was her version of a full night's rest given the schedule. She woke up to 3 missed calls, 1 from the placement agency, 1 from a number she didn't recognize, and 1 from Sandra Oakes. She listened to Sandra's voicemail first. Mara, it's Sandra. I need you to call me back before you come in tonight. Don't come in without calling me first. This is... There are things happening on our end that you need to know about before you walk through the door. Mara sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window. Early afternoon light, the specific quality of Pennsylvania summer that was too bright and a little too heavy. She could hear traffic outside. Somewhere down the street, someone was running a lawnmower. She called Sandra back. "Thank you for calling," Sandra said, and her voice had the careful quality of someone managing several things at once. "I want to be direct with you. Voss contacted the agency this morning. He's pursuing your removal from the placement. I figured. I've bought us a week on the review timeline, but I need to understand something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay." "The commander last night, the helicopter, the extension you gave the nurse, the one that doesn't exist in our system. Those things are connected to your employment history. The part I can't see." Mara didn't answer immediately. "Mara, what are you asking me, Sandra?" "I'm asking you if there's someone I can contact, someone who can speak to who you are and what your background actually is. Because right now, the only record I have is 2 formal notices and a restricted access flag, and that's not enough to fight what Voss is building." The lawnmower outside got louder for a moment and then faded. "There might be someone," Mara said carefully, "but I need to make a call first." "How long do you need?" "A few hours." "You have until tomorrow morning," Sandra said. "After that, I'm not sure I can hold the timeline." Mara hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she scrolled to a number she hadn't dialed in 8 months. The contact was listed under a first name only. No last name, no title. She pressed call. It rang twice. "I was wondering when you'd use this number," said the voice on the other end. It wasn't Deeks. It was a woman. Older, precise, with the kind of voice that had spent years giving information rather than receiving it. "Something's moving," Mara said, "faster than I expected." "I know," the woman said. "We've been watching it since this morning." "How much do you know about what's happening at the hospital?" "Enough to know that a department chief is trying to end your contract because you're better at his job than he is," the woman said. "And enough to know that the situation last night complicated things in ways that are going to be difficult to contain." "What does that mean?" "It means," the woman said, and her voice took on a weight that Mara had learned over years meant something important was coming, "that we have a problem that goes beyond Voss and your personnel file. Garrett was carrying intelligence when he came in. Not on him. That would have been managed. But the information he was transporting is now in a compromised state, and the people who were tracking him last night know he went into a civilian hospital." Mara stood up from the bed. "You're saying whoever was after him knows where he is?" "Knew," the woman said. "He's already been moved, but yes. And they also know the hospital assisted in his treatment, which means Crestfield Regional is in a window right now where it could become a secondary target." The lawnmower outside went quiet. In its absence, the afternoon felt very still. "How long is the window?" Mara asked. "We're not sure," the woman said. "That's the problem. We don't know what they have or what they're planning to do with it. What we do know is that you are the only person at that hospital who would recognize the signs if something was about to happen." "I'm being pushed out," Mara said. "Voss is moving my removal through the agency." "I know." "So what are you telling me to do?" A pause. The kind that meant the answer wasn't simple and the person giving it knew it. "I'm telling you," the woman said, "that the next 24 hours are going to ask a lot of you, and I need to know if you're still the person I think you are." Mara looked at the window. The light outside was the same as it had been a minute ago. Bright. Heavy. The particular quality of a summer afternoon in a small Pennsylvania city that had no idea what had passed through it the night before. "Send me what you have," Mara said. "Already done," the woman said. "Check your secure inbox." The call ended. Mara stood in her apartment in the still afternoon, and whatever peace she had been quietly assembling over the previous 8 months, the overnight shifts, the small victories, the careful invisibility, she felt it reorganize itself into something else entirely, something older and more angular and considerably less quiet. Her phone buzzed with a notification from an app she hadn't opened in months. She opened it. The file was already there. She started reading, and the further she got, the more the afternoon outside the window stopped mattering. The file was 11 pages. Mara read it twice. The first time fast, the way she'd been trained to read field intelligence, absorbing structure before detail, looking for the shape of the threat before the specifics of it. The second time slowly, going back over the sections that needed more than a single pass. What the file described was not a complex operation. That was the part that made it dangerous. Complex operations had more points of failure, more variables, more opportunities for something to go wrong on the aggressor's side. What was outlined in the 11 pages was simple. A two-person team. A narrow time window. A civilian target chosen not for its strategic value, but for its symbolic one. A hospital that had publicly assisted a government operative, however unintentionally, and that now represented a vulnerability worth exploiting. The team had been in Dunmore for at least 18 hours before Garrett arrived. That meant they'd been in position before the diversion, which meant the diversion itself might have been anticipated. Mara flagged that in her mind and moved on. The file included partial surveillance captures, grainy images from 2 different camera systems, one a traffic camera on the east side of Dunmore, one from a parking structure 2 blocks from Crestfield Regional. The images showed 2 individuals in separate frames. Neither face was fully visible. Both were moving with the kind of unhurried purpose that was its own kind of signature. The threat assessment at the end of the file was written in the clipped, affectless language of someone who wrote threat assessments for a living and had stopped finding them alarming around the time they became routine. It rated the probability of an action against the hospital in the next 24 hours at 63%. It noted that the window was narrow and narrowing. It recommended that the hospital's security posture be elevated without alerting the target population, meaning the patients and staff, to the specific nature of the threat. At the bottom, in a different font that indicated it had been added after the main document was compiled, was a single line: primary recommended asset for on-site threat identification. Callaway, M. Relay protocol authorized. Mara put her phone down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment. Then she went to get dressed. What? She arrived at Crestfield Regional at 4:30 in the afternoon, 2.5 hours before her overnight shift was supposed to start. She used the east entrance, which was the one closest to the parking structure in the surveillance captures, and she moved through the lobby the way she always moved through spaces, reading the room without appearing to. The lobby was running at its normal afternoon volume, visitors with flowers. A family near the elevator bank with a child who was too old for the stroller she was in but too tired to walk. An elderly man at the information desk asking something the volunteer was having trouble answering. The gift shop was open. The coffee cart near the main doors had a short line. Mara walked through it and cataloged everything she saw without slowing down. 2 men near the coffee cart, both in their 30s. One was reading something on his phone, one was looking at the menu board. They had the look of people waiting for someone. A reasonable thing to be doing in a hospital lobby. She didn't stop. She didn't look directly at them. She kept moving. She took the stairs to the second floor and went to Sandra's office. Sandra was there, which meant she'd stayed late, which meant she'd been expecting Mara to show up before shift. "Close the door," Sandra said. Mara closed it and sat down. "Tell me what I need to know," Sandra said. No preamble, no management framing, just the direct ask of someone who had decided to be in this situation fully, rather than at a careful remove. "The man we treated last night was a government operative," Mara said. "He's been moved to a secure facility, but the people who are tracking him know he came here. There's a threat assessment that puts the probability of an action against this hospital in the next 24 hours at over 60%. Sandra's face did several things in quick succession, and then went very professional. "What kind of action?" "The file doesn't specify, which means they don't know exactly. But the team that's been identified has a pattern. They don't go after infrastructure. They go after people, soft targets. They create a situation that looks like an accident or a medical event." "Inside a hospital," Sandra said. "It's actually an ideal environment if you know what you're doing. Controlled access points, predictable staff patterns, a population that's already compromised." "Jesus," Sandra said, and then seemed to remember something and looked at Mara carefully. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to contact hospital security and tell them you're implementing an enhanced visitor screening protocol effective immediately. Use the excuse of a regional infectious disease advisory. There's one active in the county right now. I checked before I came in. That gives you grounds to require ID check at all entry points without triggering a lockdown. That's going to take time to implement. I know. That's why I'm here 2 hours early. Mara paused. I also need you to pull the schedule and tell me who's working tonight, specifically in the ER and the 4th floor. The 4th floor? That's where the operative was. He's not there anymore. But if they don't know that, it's still a target. Sandra pulled up the scheduling system and turned her screen so Mara could see it. They went through it together, Mara asking occasional questions about staff members she hadn't worked with directly, Sandra answering them with the economy of someone who kept her assessments short and accurate. Whitfield's on overnight ER again, Sandra noted. Good, Mara said. He's solid under pressure. Joanna's on your floor. Also good. They went through the rest of the list. Then Sandra asked the question she'd been holding since Mara sat down. How do you know all of this? Not last night. I understand last night, situationally. But this, she gestured vaguely at the conversation they'd just had. This isn't nursing school. No, Mara said. Were you military? I was something that operated adjacent to military, Mara said. The distinction matters, but it's not something I can explain in full right now. Can you explain enough? Mara looked at her. I was a combat medic first. Then I was trained further. Then I did work that I'm not going to describe in detail, because the detail isn't what's useful to you right now. What's useful is that I know how these situations develop, and I know how to read the signs before they develop into something we can't manage. Sandra absorbed this. And the 2 formal notices in your file were consequences of me doing what I know how to do in an environment that wasn't built for it, Mara said. Voss isn't wrong about the protocol. He's wrong about what the protocol is for. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Okay, she said. Tell me what to do, and I'll do it. Itet. By 5:15, the ID check protocol was active at all 3 main entry points. Sandra had briefed security with the infectious disease framing, and the security chief, a heavyset former state trooper named Carl Britton, had implemented it without complaint. He was also, at Mara's quiet request passed through Sandra, walking the 4th floor perimeter every 20 minutes instead of the standard 40. Mara had also made one other request that Sandra had looked at sideways but honored without argument. She wanted the 2 men from the lobby identified. Britton pulled the lobby camera footage from the last 3 hours. The man with the phone and the man looking at the menu board appeared in 17 minutes of footage across 4 different camera angles. They'd bought coffee. They'd sat near the window. They'd had a brief conversation that the cameras couldn't capture the audio of, and then one of them had left and the other had moved to a chair closer to the elevator bank. The one who stayed was still in the lobby when Britton pulled the footage. Mara looked at the freeze frame. She studied the posture, the hand placement, the angle of the body relative to the elevator bank. He's watching who goes up, she said. Britton looked at the same image. Could be waiting for someone. Could be, Mara said. But he's been here for over 2 hours. Visitors with a specific person to see don't wait 2 hours in the lobby. They go up. If they can't go up, they leave and come back. What do you want me to do? Ask him, nicely, whether he needs help finding who he's here to see. If he has a name, you can verify it against patient registry. If he doesn't have a name, you have cause to ask him to wait in a designated area or leave. And if he leaves, then we know something, Mara said. Britton went down to the lobby. Mara watched on the security monitor from the 2nd floor station. The conversation took less than 3 minutes. The man's body language was cooperative, unhurried, easy. He smiled at something Britton said. He appeared to give a name. Britton nodded and went to the desk to verify. The name wasn't in patient registry. The man said something else. Britton came back to the desk and made a phone call. Checked something on the volunteer's screen. While Britton was at the desk with his back turned, the man stood up, walked to the main door and left. Britton turned around to find an empty chair. Mara's jaw tightened. She picked up the radio Britton had given her. He's out the main entrance. Which direction? Britton went to the door. Left, toward the parking structure. Don't follow him, let him go. She set the radio down. The parking structure, the same one in the surveillance images. She called the number from that afternoon. It rang once. He was just inside, she said when the line connected. It wasn't the same woman. It was a man she didn't know, which meant the duty had shifted. Lobby surveillance. He made contact with security and exited when verification was requested. He went toward the parking structure on Clement. "We see him," the man said. "He's on foot." "Is the second one with him?" "Negative. Second is unaccounted for." Mara didn't say anything for a moment. The security monitor showed the lobby, now looking normal, visitors and staff moving through with no indication that anything had changed. "The second one isn't in the lobby," she said. "He left 17 minutes before the first one. If they separated intentionally, the first one was the decoy." "Agreed. Which means the second one is already inside." A pause on the line that was half a second too long. "We're working on locating him," the man said. "Work faster," Mara said, and ended the call. She stood in the second-floor corridor and thought about it from the beginning. Two people. Separate entry points or separate timing. One stays visible. One disappears. In a hospital, disappearing wasn't hard. Staff corridors, service elevators, stairwells, linen storage. The footprint of a large medical facility was enormous, and the people who moved through it were expected to look like they belonged. She walked to the nursing station and pulled up the floor-by-floor patient census. Fourth floor was at 72% capacity. Third floor, her floor, was at 88. The second floor was administrative and procedural, low patient volume. The first floor was the ER, the lobby, imaging, and the main support services. She thought about what the file had said. They go after people, soft targets, create a situation that looks like an accident or a medical event. In a hospital, the most reliable soft targets were patients who were already ill. A medication error, a device malfunction, a compromised IV line, all of it attributable to the chaos of a busy shift, the kind of thing that happened in overloaded hospitals all the time, the kind of thing that would take days or weeks to fully investigate, by which point whoever had done it would be long gone. She was already moving toward the stairs when the overhead PA activated. "Nursing staff to room 412. Nursing staff to room 412. Fourth floor. Room 412 was 2 doors from where Garrett had been before transport. Mara took the stairs 2 at a time. What? She came through the 4th floor stairwell door to find Nurse Priya Anand, the charge nurse for the 4th floor overnight rotation, who had just started her shift 20 minutes ago, already outside room 412 with a look on her face that was trying to stay controlled and not entirely succeeding. "What happened?" Mara said. "Patient in 412, Mrs. Halbrook, 67, post-op hip replacement, day 3 recovery. She was fine at my 4:30 check. She's altered now. Confused, BP dropping, temp spiking." Priya's voice was clipped and professional, but her eyes were doing the thing eyes did when a nurse was calculating outcomes and not liking the math. "I've got the attending paged, but she's in a procedure downstairs." "What changed in the room since 4:30? Mara said. "Nothing on my end. I had a new volunteer bring up her dinner tray at 5. Other than that, a volunteer." Priya stopped. "What did the volunteer look like?" Mara said. I didn't see him directly. He came through the regular volunteer corridor. He had a badge." Mara pushed the door to 412 open and went in. Mrs. Halbrook was in her late 60s, white-haired, and she was sweating through her gown in the way that wasn't post-surgical discomfort. Her eyes were open but unfocused, tracking the ceiling with the slow, confused movement of someone whose brain was not receiving the information it needed. Her IV line was running. Her monitor showed the dropping pressure Priya had described and a heart rate that was elevated and irregular in a specific pattern. Mara looked at the IV line. Then she looked at the secondary port. There was a small, almost imperceptible residue near the injection site, barely visible, the kind of thing you wouldn't see if you weren't looking for it and knew what it looked like. She turned to Priya in the doorway. "Stop the IV, right now. New line, new bag, different arm." Priya came in immediately and started working without asking why. That was the thing about experienced nurses. When someone who clearly knew what they were doing gave a clear instruction, you moved first and asked questions after. "Get me a talk screen, full panel, expedited, and I need the attending here, not paged, pulled from the procedure if necessary. Tell them we have a suspected poisoning." "Poisoning," Priya repeated, and her voice stayed flat, because she was good at her job, but she went pale. The IV line was compromised. I don't know what's in it yet. That's what the talk screen is for. Mara was already at the patient's side, checking pupil response, checking mucous membranes, running through the indicators that might tell her what had been introduced before the lab results came back. Mrs. Halbrook, can you hear me? My name is Mara. You're at Crestfield Regional. I need you to try to squeeze my hand. A pause. Then a weak, uneven pressure against her fingers. Good, Mara said. That's good. Stay with me. She ran through what she was seeing. The altered consciousness, the BP pattern, the tachycardia. It was consistent with several things, some naturally occurring, some not. The residue at the injection site narrowed it, not dramatically, but enough to think in a specific direction. Priya, does this unit carry activated charcoal? Not routinely. ER does. Call down and get it moving, and get me a glucometer reading. Priya was on the phone before Mara finished the sentence. The attending physician arrived 4 minutes later. Doctor, Voss was not on call that evening. That was a mercy Mara noted without dwelling on. The attending was Dr. Fiona Merck, a hospitalist who covered the 4th and 5th floors on the overnight rotation and who had been practicing for 22 years and had a manner that was brisk without being cold. Merck took in the room in one pass and moved to the bedside. Talk to me, she said. Mara talked. She gave it fast and clean. The timeline, the IV change, the visual indicator at the injection port, the symptom pattern, the talk screen she'd already ordered. She didn't editorialize. She gave Merck the clinical picture and let her arrive at her own conclusion. Merck arrived at it quickly. You're saying someone got to the IV line. I'm saying the presentation is inconsistent with any natural complication of her surgery or her baseline history. The onset is too sudden, and there is a physical indicator at the secondary port that suggests external introduction of a substance. That's a serious allegation. I know, Mara said, which is why I'm telling you instead of documenting it and waiting. Merck looked at her. Something moved behind the physician's eyes. The particular calculation of a clinician who has been in enough situations to know when another person's read is worth trusting. What's your clinical background? I'm the overnight floor nurse. That's not what I asked. Mara met her eyes. It's the answer I have right now. Merck held the look for 2 seconds and then made a decision. All right, let's treat it as a poisoning and work backward from there if I'm wrong. I'd rather be wrong in the safe direction. She turned to Priya. Get me a crash cart staged in the hallway. Get pharmacy on the line and tell them we need a consult for potential toxic ingestion or IV introduction. And someone pull this patient's visitor log for the last 4 hours. Priya moved. Mara moved with her. They were in the hallway when Mara's phone buzzed. She looked at it while walking. A text from the number she'd called 20 minutes ago. 4 words. Second asset still unlocated. She stopped walking. Priya looked back at her. What? Keep going, Mara said. Get the crash cart. Get pharmacy. I'll be right behind you. She stood in the 4th floor hallway and looked at the text again. The man in the lobby had been a decoy. The second man had gotten inside and accessed room 412. But Mrs. Halbrook was a 70-year-old hip replacement patient with no connection to anything military or governmental. She was not a strategic target, which meant she wasn't the target. She was the distraction. Mara looked at the hallway in both directions, at the nursing station, at the stairwell door at the far end, at the elevator bank in the middle. The elevator indicator showed a car sitting on the 4th floor. It had been there since she came out of the stairwell. She walked toward it. The door was not fully closed. It was held open by a small gap, not mechanical failure because the pressure sensor would have re-triggered the motor. Held by something deliberate. She got close enough to see it without getting close enough to be a problem if something happened. A supply cart. One wheel of a standard hospital supply cart wedged against the door track. She looked at the cart, looked at what was on it. A linen stack on the top shelf. A box of disposable gloves. A covered tray on the lower shelf. She looked at the covered tray. Then she looked at the stairwell door at the far end of the hall, which was clicking. Not swinging, not fully open, just clicking. the sound of a latch that was being held just barely disengaged from the other side. Someone was behind that door, watching to see what she did with the cart. Mara's mind ran the geometry in about 2 seconds flat. Supply cart. Covered tray. Elevator held open. Person behind the stairwell door watching the cart. The tray was either the delivery mechanism or the misdirection. She did not touch the cart. She took 3 steps back from the elevator, turned around, and walked at a normal pace to the nursing station. She picked up the desk phone and called Britton directly. 4th floor, now. Stairwell at the north end, Bachich. Someone is holding the door from the south side. Don't use the stairwell, use the service elevator, and bring 2 people. She hung up. Then she called the number again. The same man answered. I have a location, Mara said. North stairwell, 4th floor, Crestfield Regional. He's on the south side of the door. There's also a supply cart at the elevator bank I haven't touched. Might be secondary. You need eyes on this building right now. We have a team 4 minutes out, the man said. 4 minutes is a long time, Mara said. Can you hold it? She looked down the hallway. The stairwell door was still clicking softly. Britton was 3 floors down. Merck was in room 412 with a patient who was currently the priority of every nurse on the floor. The 4th floor hallway was otherwise empty. Yeah, she said. I can hold it. She put the phone in her scrub pocket and stood at the nursing station and thought about the 11 pages she had read that afternoon, and the threat assessment that gave it 63%, and the woman in room 412 whose IV line had been compromised to create exactly this moment. A cleared hallway, a distracted staff, and Mara standing alone between a stairwell door and a supply cart with a covered tray that she had not yet identified. The stairwell door made a different sound, not clicking anymore, opening. The door opened 3 inches before it stopped. Mara was already moving, not toward it, away from the nursing station, putting the desk between herself and the stairwell in a single unhurried step that looked like nothing from a distance, but that cut the angle. She picked up a patient chart from the rack, opened it, and stood reading with her eyes on the paper and her full attention on the door at the end of the hall. A man came through. He was in his early 40s, medium build, wearing hospital-issue scrubs that fit him well enough to be real or purchased recently. He had a badge clipped to his collar. From this distance, she couldn't read it, but it was the right color and the right format for a Crestfield Regional Staff ID. He was moving with the particular unhurry of someone who had decided the best cover was confidence, and he was good at it, not perfect. His right hand stayed close to his body in a way that wasn't natural for someone who was just walking. He moved toward the elevator bank, toward the supply cart. Mara kept reading the chart. She tracked him in her peripheral vision, measured the distance, calculated what happened next if she was wrong about the tray, and what happened next if she was right. He stopped at the cart. He reached for the lower shelf. Sir? Her voice was level and carried exactly far enough to reach him without carrying past. He turned. She was looking at him now, chart closed, both hands visible on the nursing station counter. Can I help you find something? She said. A pause. He read her the same way she'd read him. Fast, professional, reaching a conclusion. Wrong floor, he said. His voice was flat and regionally neutral, the kind of accent that had been trained out of something more specific. Sorry. What floor are you looking for? 3. Elevator's right there, Mara said. Gonna be a minute, though. Door's been held. You might want the east elevator around the corner. She watched him decide. It took less than 2 seconds. He left the cart and walked toward the corner she'd pointed to, moving with the same unhurried confidence. She watched until he rounded the corner. Then she picked up the desk phone and called Britton's radio line. He's heading for the east elevator. Medium build, 40s, scrubs, badge on collar, right-hand guarded. Do not approach him in the elevator. Wait until he's on the ground floor or exits. There are people coming. Copy, Britton said. He sounded out of breath. He was moving. She went to the supply cart and crouched down to look at the covered tray without touching it. The cover was a standard stainless dome, the kind used for meal delivery. The seam around the base was slightly uneven on one side. Not enough to notice if you weren't looking, but the dome had been lifted and replaced rather than placed fresh. She straightened up and took 3 steps back. The east elevator dinged. Then she heard Britton's voice on the radio at the nursing station, tinny and urgent. "He made the team in the lobby. He's running." Mara was already at the stairwell. She went down 1 floor, not all the way, just far enough, and listened. Footsteps below, moving fast. The east stairwell led out near the imaging department on the ground floor, which connected to the east parking lot. If he got to a vehicle in the next 90 seconds, she was going to lose him to exterior surveillance. She went down the rest of the way. She came through the ground floor stairwell door into the imaging corridor, and he was there, 30 feet ahead, moving fast, and he'd seen her at the same moment she came through the door. He adjusted his route without breaking stride, cutting left toward the supply corridor that ran along the back of the imaging department. Mara ran. She wasn't faster than him over distance. He had 4 inches and a long stride on her, but the supply corridor had a T intersection 40 feet in, and she knew this building, and she was pretty sure he didn't, not completely. She cut right at the stairwell, went through the linen access door, came out on the other side of the T intersection 6 seconds before he reached it. He came around the corner and stopped. She was standing in the middle of the corridor. He assessed the geometry. She was blocking the route to the exit. Behind him was the imaging corridor, and beyond that, the lobby where Britton's team was. He was smart enough to understand the math immediately. "You don't want to do this," he said. "I don't want to do a lot of things," Mara said. "I still do them." He moved. He was trained. That much was clear immediately. He moved fast and with the economy of someone who understood how bodies work and how to use that knowledge against another body. Mara absorbed the first contact, redirected the second, and used the third to put him against the wall with her forearm across his collar and his right wrist controlled behind him at an angle that made continuing expensive. He tried once. She increased the angle. He stopped. They were both breathing hard. The corridor smelled like industrial cleaner and warm linen. "Don't move," she said. Not aggressive, just information. 2 of Britton's team came around the corner at a run 30 seconds later. They took over without ceremony, and Mara stepped back and stood in the corridor with her hands on her knees for a moment, catching her breath, feeling the specific kind of tired that came from a body that had done something it knew how to do but hadn't done in a while. Her elbow was going to hurt tomorrow. She straightened up and pulled out her phone. Called the number. "Second asset is contained, ground floor supply corridor. Your team is going to need to come get him before the police arrive, because if local PD gets him first, this becomes a very different kind of situation." "Team is in the parking lot," the man said. 2 minutes. "The supply cart on 4 still hasn't been cleared. Send someone for that too." "Understood." She hung up and leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling of the supply corridor and thought about Mrs. Halbrook upstairs, and whether the talk screen was back yet, and whether the activated charcoal had arrived from the ER. Britton came around the corner. He was a large man, and running had not agreed with him, but he was upright and functional. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," Mara said. "You?" "I've had worse Thursdays." He looked at the man his team was restraining. "Who is he?" "Not my story to tell," Mara said. "But the people who need to take custody of him are 2 minutes out. Can you hold him that long?" "I can hold him all night if I have to." 2 minutes is enough, Mara said, and went back to the stairs. Mrs. Halbrook stabilized at 8:47. The tox panel came back at 9:12 and identified the substance as a synthetic compound that affected coagulation and vascular permeability, sophisticated enough to be mistaken for a post-surgical complication in a patient who was already on blood thinners for her hip recovery. It would have taken a specific kind of scrutiny to catch it. The kind of scrutiny that was available in a hospital where a night shift nurse with a very particular background happened to be on duty. Dr. Merck stood outside room 412 with the lab results in her hand and found Mara at the nursing station. "She's going to be okay," Merck said. "Good," Mara said. "The substance in that line, that's not something a person finds at a pharmacy." "No," Mara agreed. Merck looked at her for a long moment. She had the expression of someone reassembling a picture from pieces that kept arriving in the wrong order. "The security team downstairs, the people who came and took the man Britton's team detained, they weren't police." "No." "And you knew they were coming." I knew there was a threat. I didn't know how it was going to move. But you stayed, Merck said. When you figured out what was happening, you stayed on this floor. Mara glanced toward room 412. She's 67 years old, and she had a hip replaced because she wanted to keep hiking with her grandchildren. Someone used her as a distraction. I wasn't going to leave. Merck was quiet for a moment. Voss is going to try to terminate your placement tomorrow morning, she said. I heard about the call to the agency. I know. Does what happened tonight change that? Only if the right people make sure it's part of the record, Mara said. Merck nodded once, slowly. Then I'll make sure it's part of the record, she said. The federal team left Crestfield Regional at 11:15. They took the second man, cleared the supply cart. The covered tray contained a secondary delivery mechanism for the same compound used on Mrs. Halbrook, designed for the hospital's water supply access point on the 4th floor, and left no visible trace of their presence except for a set of documentation requests sent to Sandra Oakes's administrative email at 11:42 that evening, which she found when she finally sat down at her desk and which she read 3 times before she understood their full scope. The documentation requests were from a federal oversight office. They were formal, specific, and addressed to Crestfield Regional Medical Center's administration. They requested complete personnel files, incident reports, and disciplinary records for the nursing department, with specific reference to any disciplinary actions taken against staff members in the preceding 12 months. They also requested, in the final paragraph, the complete disciplinary file of one Mara Calloway, night shift registered nurse, along with all documentation related to the formal notices filed against her by Department Chief Dr. Elliot Voss. Sandra read that paragraph a 4th time. Then she called Mara. Are you still in the building? She asked. Finishing my shift, Mara said. I just got a federal documentation request for your file. Both of Voss's notices. Everything. Silence on the line. Mara. I'm here. Did you know this was going to happen? A pause. I knew it was possible. I didn't know the timing. Voss is going to find out in the morning, Sandra said. When he calls the agency to follow up on your removal, and the agency tells him there's a federal hold on any personnel action involving you. That's going to be a difficult morning for him, Mara said. He's going to push back. He has standing. He has 2 formal notices and last night's incident. He also has a patient who's alive because of last night's incident, Mara said. And a 3rd incident that's going to look very different depending on who's reading the report. Sandra thought about that. I'm going to need to brief the hospital's legal counsel tonight, before morning. You should, Mara said. And Sandra, thank you for slowing down the agency review, for the screening protocol, for doing what you did without asking me to explain things I couldn't explain. I asked you a lot of questions, Sandra said. You asked the right ones, Mara said. That's different. After she hung up, Sandra sat at her desk and looked at the documentation request again. 12 months of disciplinary records, specifically Voss's notices. She thought about the 2 formal notices, the medication adjustment, the discharge flag, both of them situations where a patient had been protected by the judgment of a nurse a department chief had decided was out of place. Both of them translated by that same department chief into evidence of insubordination. She thought about how that was going to read to a federal oversight office. She opened a new document and started writing. Voss found out at 8:17 the next morning. He called the placement agency at 8 o'clock, the first call he made after getting his coffee. Louise Trant answered on the second ring and told him in the careful voice of someone delivering information they'd been waiting to deliver that there was a federal administrative hold on all personnel actions related to Mara Calloway pending a documentation review, and that the agency was not in a position to proceed with any placement modification until the hold was resolved. Voss said several things. Louise Trant said almost nothing in response, which was a particular kind of answer. He arrived at Crestfield Regional at 8:40. He went directly to Sandra's office. Sandra was ready for him. She had been in the building since 6:30. She had briefed legal counsel by phone at midnight and in person at 7. She had her documentation organized. She had also had a conversation with Dr. Merck at 7:15 that had added 3 specific items to what she needed to say, and she had those items written out on a notepad that she kept in front of her when Voss walked in. He looked the way people looked when they were angry and trying to manage it with professionalism, and the professionalism was losing. "I want to understand what's happening," he said, "because I filed a formal complaint through appropriate channels, and I'm being told there's a federal hold that was apparently applied overnight." "Sit down, Elliot," Sandra said. He sat. He didn't want to, but he did. "Last night, Crestfield Regional was the site of a federal security incident," Sandra said. "I'm limited in what I can share about the specifics, but I can tell you that a patient on the 4th floor was the victim of deliberate tampering with her IV line, that the substance used was identified by lab analysis as a sophisticated synthetic compound, and that the incident was contained without loss of life." Voss stared at her. "What?" "The incident was identified and responded to by Mara Calloway, who was on shift at the time. She identified the tampered line, ordered the appropriate tox screening, coordinated with hospital security, and physically detained one of the individuals involved until federal personnel arrived to take custody. The silence in the room was a specific kind, the kind where someone is recalculating something that has become much larger than they understood it to be. "She's a floor nurse," Voss said. "She's a floor nurse with a background that she was under no obligation to disclose to this hospital and that she did not disclose," Sandra said. "A background that apparently includes significant combat medical training and experience in environments I'm not going to speculate about. What I can tell you is that last night she identified a covert threat in this building that no one else on shift was trained to see, and she handled it in a way that protected a patient and a staff of over 40 people who were working in a building that had been targeted." Voss's mouth was slightly open. He closed it. "The federal documentation request covers your 2 formal notices," Sandra said. "Both of them. They want the incident reports, the clinical records, and your written justification for each action. Those notices were procedurally correct." "They were procedurally correct," Sandra agreed. "They were also both filed in response to situations where Mara's clinical judgment was demonstrably accurate and her actions protected patients from harm. That context is going to be part of the record." "I didn't know No," Sandra said. "You didn't know. That's actually the point, Elliot. You made 2 formal decisions about a staff member's capacity and authority based on information you didn't verify and an assessment you didn't revisit when new evidence kept arriving." She kept her voice level. She wasn't enjoying this exactly, but she wasn't softening it either. "She caught a ruptured spleen you missed. She caught a medication interaction. She flagged a discharge that had a pulmonary embolism behind it. And last night she saved a patient's life and held a federal security incident together with Britain's security team and whatever she's carrying around from a history we didn't bother to ask about." Voss looked at the table. He had the expression of a man who was intelligent enough to understand the shape of what was coming and too honest with himself to pretend it wasn't the shape he deserved. "What happens now?" he said. "The federal review will determine what happens with your notices in Mara's file," Sandra said. "I think we both know how that's likely to go. As for the internal side, I've spoken with legal and I've spoken with the CMO's office this morning. There's going to be a review of the department's clinical oversight protocols, specifically the process by which nursing staff can escalate patient safety concerns. That's a policy review. It's a consequence," Sandra said. "There are going to be others. I'm not in a position to tell you what they look like yet. What I can tell you is that this conversation is being documented, and I'd encourage you to engage legal counsel of your own before the federal review contacts you directly." Voss stood up. He straightened his jacket with the automatic gesture of someone reasserting something that had just been significantly reduced. "For what it's worth," he said, and his voice had lost the quality it had when he walked in, the controlled anger, the professional surety, "I was not wrong about the protocol. The protocol exists." "The protocol exists to protect patients," Sandra said. "When you used it to protect your authority from someone who was protecting patients, you inverted it. That's what the record is going to show." He left. Sandra sat in her office for a minute after the door closed. Then she picked up her pen and made a note on the notepad and thought about all the patients who'd moved through Mara Calloway's care in 7 months, and how many of them had no idea what had stood between them and something worse. Mara was coming off her overnight shift when Joanna found her at the locker room door. "Heard Voss had a rough morning," Joanna said. "I heard something like that," Mara said. "Merck told me what happened last night. Not the classified parts, just what you did on 4. Joanna leaned against the wall with the particular posture of someone who has something to say and is deciding how directly to say it. "I've been a nurse for 11 years. I've worked with people who are good at this job, really good. And I've never seen anyone move the way you move in a building during a crisis." "I've had some practice," Mara said. "No kidding," Joanna paused. "The woman in 412, Mrs. Halbrook. Her daughter came in this morning. She wanted to know who to thank." "Tell her to thank the lab team," Mara said. The talk screen is what confirmed it. "Mara." "The lab team," Mara said again, with enough finality that it closed the subject. She opened the locker room door. "They're talking about your placement," Joanna said to her back. "Whether you stay, whether the federal thing changes the contract status, whether the hospital makes a permanent offer." Mara stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "What do you think happens?" "I think you stay," Joanna said. "I think they'd be idiots not to find a way to keep you. And I think most of the department knows that now, even the ones who were careful about what side they picked when Voss was filing those notices." "Being a useful tool and being respected are different things," Mara said. "Yeah," Joanna said. "They are. I'm not going to pretend they're the same. But it's a start." Mara nodded and went through the door. She showered and changed and sat on the bench in front of her locker for a moment longer than she needed to. The locker room was empty. It smelled like industrial soap and the particular humidity of a space too many people used. She was tired in the specific and complete way that came after a body had spent an entire night running on things other than rest. She thought about Garrett, somewhere in a secure facility, his daughter 4 years old and unaware of how close the night had come. She thought about Mrs. Halbrook's confusion clearing as the IV ran clean, the slow return of focus in her eyes. She thought about the 11 pages she'd read in her apartment in the afternoon light, and how a week ago her life had been the overnight floor rotation and the quiet accumulation of shifts and the patient in 324 who didn't want to be alone before surgery. She wasn't sure which version of the days ahead she was walking toward. She suspected she wasn't going to get to choose cleanly between them. Her phone buzzed. Not the secure app. Her regular phone. A number she recognized. The hospital's main administrative line. She answered. "Ms. Calloway." The voice was one she didn't know. Not Sandra, not legal counsel. A man, older, measured. "My name is Richard Odom. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Crestfield Regional. I'd like to meet with you today if you're available." "About my placement?" Mara said. "Among other things," he said. "I've spent the last 2 hours reading your file. The complete file, including the sections that required some additional authorization to access." A pause. "I have some questions, and I also have something I'd like to offer. I'd rather do both in person." Mara looked at the locker room wall. "What time?" "Whenever works for you. I'll be here." She thought about sleep. She thought about what Joanna had said about useful tools and respect. "Give me an hour," she said. She hung up and sat for another moment. Then she stood, shouldered her bag, and walked out of the locker room toward whatever was coming next. She made it to the lobby before her phone buzzed again. This time it was the secure app. She stopped walking and opened it. The message was from the woman she'd spoken to the previous afternoon. 3 sentences. "Review of the Dunmore incident is complete. Secondary analysis identified a third asset, not the 2 you engaged. Third asset was not at the hospital." Mara read it twice. Third asset was at your apartment building. She stood in the hospital lobby with morning light coming through the main doors and people moving around her in the ordinary flow of a hospital morning. Visitors arriving, staff changing shifts, a child in a waiting chair kicking her feet against the seat. And she looked at the message and understood what it meant. Someone had been watching where she lived, not last night, before the diversion, before Garrett, before the helicopter on the roof, before any of it. Which meant they hadn't come to Crestfield Regional because Garrett was there. They'd come because she was. She stood in the lobby for 11 seconds. That was how long it took her to read the message 3 times, run the implications forward, and make a decision. 11 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In the context of understanding that you have been the target, not the incidental complication, not the secondary concern, but the actual target, 11 seconds is enough to reorganize everything you thought you knew about the last 18 hours into something with a different shape entirely. She called the secure line. The woman answered this time. Not the man from the overnight shift, the woman from the afternoon before, with the precise voice and the long history of giving information clearly. "Talk to me," Mara said. "Third asset was identified this morning through building surveillance cross-reference. He was in your apartment building's parking structure from approximately 6:30 yesterday evening until 2 this morning. We think he was there to determine your schedule and confirm your presence before the hospital operation moved." "They weren't after Garrett," Mara said. "Garrett was genuine. His diversion to Crestfield was genuine. But the team that was already in Dunmore, the two you engaged, they weren't tracking Garrett. They were tracking the hospital because we tracked you to the hospital 8 months ago and someone accessed that information." The lobby moved around her. A family near the elevators. A volunteer pushing a cart. A man in a visitor badge holding a cup of coffee and reading something on his phone. Mara looked at the man with the coffee. He was in his 60s. He had a hearing aid and a lanyard that said guest in red letters. He looked up from his phone, caught her looking at him, and gave the small nod of two strangers briefly acknowledging each other in a public space. She looked away. "Who accessed it?" she asked. "That's what we're working on," the woman said. "We have a narrowed field, someone with access to the asset placement records from your transition out, which is a limited number of people." "How limited?" 11, the woman said. "We'll have it down further by end of day." "And the third asset? Where is he now?" "Gone. Left the building when you didn't come home last night. We have him on camera exiting the structure at 2:14. We're tracking him." Mara processed this. "So the operation failed because I wasn't home?" "The operation failed because you were doing your job at a hospital where a military operative happened to need emergency surgery," the woman said. "The coincidence is almost funny." "Not quite," Mara said. "No," the woman agreed. "Not quite." A pause. "Mara, you need to know that this changes your status. You are operating as a civilian under a quiet transition. That's no longer an accurate description of your situation. I know. There are people here who want to bring you back in, formally, with full cover and support. What happened last night, what you did, it's not something we can pretend didn't happen." "I have a meeting with the CMO in an hour," Mara said. A brief silence. "That's interesting timing." "I thought so too," Mara said. "I'll call you after." She put the phone in her pocket and stood for another moment in the lobby she'd walked through hundreds of times on overnight shifts and thought about what it meant to be a target versus what it meant to be a person trying to live a quieter life, and how cleanly those two things had just collapsed into each other. Then she went home, showered the overnight shift off her skin, changed into clothes that weren't scrubs, and drove back to the hospital. Richard Odom's office was on the 6th floor, which Mara had never had reason to visit. It was a corner office with 2 windows and a view of the Dunmore skyline that was modest but genuine, a mid-sized Pennsylvania city doing its modest, genuine best against a gray July morning. Autumn was 70, or close to it, with the compact stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where decisions had weight and had learned that unnecessary motion was a kind of waste. He stood when she came in and shook her hand with both of his, which was either a formality or a statement, and Mara wasn't sure yet which. "Sit down, Ms. Calloway," he said. "Can I get you anything?" "No, thank you," she said. He sat across from her. There was a folder on the desk between them. He didn't open it immediately. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said, "because I think you prefer that, and because I don't have enough hours in the day for anything else. I've been CMO at this hospital for 12 years. In 12 years, I've had 3 situations that required me to access restricted federal personnel files. Yours is the 4th. Mara waited. "What I read this morning is not something I'm going to summarize in this room because most of it is above any classification level this hospital operates at," he said. "What I can tell you is that I now understand the complete picture of who you are and what you did during your time on our overnight rotation, And I want to start by saying that what was done to you here, the formal notices, the rotation restriction, the escalation restriction, was wrong. Not procedurally wrong, necessarily. Wrong in the way that matters more than procedure. Dr. Voss made decisions based on what he saw, Mara said. He made decisions based on what he was willing to see, Odom said. That's a different thing, and you know it is. He opened the folder. I've reviewed both notices with legal counsel and with the federal liaison who contacted us this morning. Both notices are being formally removed from your personnel file effective today. The removal will be documented, and the documentation will note the specific clinical outcomes associated with each incident, the outcomes that the notices failed to account for. Removing them from the file doesn't change what happened, Mara said. No, Odom said. It doesn't. And I'm not going to pretend that a piece of paper corrects 7 months of being treated as though your judgment was a liability when it was consistently the most accurate clinical judgment in the room. He looked at her steadily. I'm also not going to offer you an apology on behalf of an institution and call that sufficient. What I'm going to offer you is something more concrete. He turned a page in the folder. Crestfield Regional is restructuring its clinical escalation protocols. The policy that Dr. Voss implemented, the one that restricted your ability to flag concerns outside your assigned section, is being repealed as of this week. In its place, we're building a formal nursing clinical liaison structure, a pathway for experienced nursing staff to escalate patient safety concerns directly to the CMO's office, bypassing department chief authority in cases where a department chief is the source of the conflict. Mara looked at the page he'd turned to. She could see the draft framework. It was detailed. It hadn't been written in the last 2 hours. You started this before today, she said. I started it 3 months ago, Odom said, after I reviewed the quarterly incident reports and noticed that patient safety flags from the overnight nursing rotation were being buried under department chief responses that didn't address the clinical substance. I didn't know it was your flag specifically until this morning, but the pattern was there. He paused. I should have moved faster. That's on me. Mara looked at the framework. She thought about the patient in 324 who'd been scared before surgery, the sepsis flag at 3 in the morning, Mrs. Halbrook's IV line, and the specific kind of attention it took to notice what had been done to it. What are you asking me? She said. I'm asking you to lead it, Odom said, not as a floor nurse, as a clinical patient safety liaison, a new position, full-time, with formal authority to review escalation cases across all nursing departments and direct access to this office when something needs to move fast. He folded his hands on the desk. I'm also asking you to help train the next generation of nurses in what it actually looks like to catch the things that get missed. Because what you do, the way you read a room, read a patient, read a situation, that's not entirely teachable, but it's not entirely innate either. And we need more people who can do some version of it. The room was quiet. Outside the windows, Dunmore was going about its morning. Clouds were moving over the buildings, the particular midsummer gray that promised rain by afternoon. I have a complication, Mara said. I know, Odom said. The federal situation. My status changed overnight. There are people who want me back in an operational capacity. That's a conversation I haven't finished having. Can you have it and still be here? Mara thought about that honestly. I don't know yet, she said. Odom nodded. Then let me say this. Whatever you decide about the other part of your life, the part of it that I read about this morning and that I'm not going to pretend I fully understand, the offer stands. The position stands. If you need time to work out what your situation looks like going forward, take the time. This hospital is not going anywhere, and neither is the need for what you do. He closed the folder and slid it across the desk toward her. That's yours, he said. The file, the framework, the draft position description. Read it when you have time, argue with any of it you want to argue with, and when you're ready to talk again, call my direct line. He wrote a number on a notepad, tore the sheet off, and set it on top of the folder. Mara picked up both. She stood, and he stood with her. One more thing, he said. Dr. Voss has been placed on administrative leave pending the internal review. That's not a punishment, it's a process. But I want you to know that the process is real and it will have real outcomes. Whatever those outcomes are, They'll be documented, and they will be part of the public record that this hospital maintains. What happens to him? Mara asked. Not with satisfaction, just the question. That depends on the review. At minimum, he will not return to a department chief role. The pattern of suppressing clinical escalations is not something this institution can allow in a position of that authority. Beyond that, Odom exhaled. He's a good physician. He's a poor manager of anything he finds threatening. Those are two truths that can coexist and that the review will have to account for. Mara nodded. She walked to the door. Then she stopped. The nursing staff, she said, without turning around. The ones who kept their distance when the notices went in. They were protecting themselves. I don't want whatever comes next to treat them like they were the problem. They weren't the problem, Odom said. The system was the problem. That's what we're fixing. She left. The federal conversation happened at 2 p.m, on a call that lasted 47 minutes and included the woman with the precise voice and a man Mara hadn't spoken to before who identified himself only by his role and not his name, which was normal. They told her what they knew about the third asset, which was more than they'd had that morning. He had been identified through a secondary camera system in Mara's building and cross-referenced against a known network with operations in 3 countries. The breach in the placement records had been narrowed from 11 people to 3, and they expected to have a confirmed identification within 24 hours. They also told her that the operation against Crestfield Regional, the 2 assets she'd engaged, the targeted patient, the supply cart, was the second attempt. The first had been 6 weeks earlier, in a different city, against a different former asset who had also transitioned to a civilian medical role. That person had not been as fortunate. Mara sat with that information for a moment before she responded. You've had a pattern for 6 weeks, and last night was the first time I was told about any of it, she said. The threat assessment against your specific location was elevated based on Garrett's diversion, the man said. Before that, your site was rated as low probability. That assessment was wrong, Mara said. Yes, he said. It was. She appreciated that he didn't dress it up. What changed? Why me, specifically? We think it's retaliatory, the woman said. Related to an operation you were part of 4 years ago, a disruption that had long-tail consequences we didn't fully anticipate at the time. The Vilmos network, Mara said. Yes. She'd thought about that operation exactly twice in the last 2 years, both times in the middle of the night, not because it haunted her, but because it was the kind of thing you couldn't entirely put down. It had been a successful disruption of a trafficking operation that moved people and information across 3 international borders. It had also been the operation that had broken something in her. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way that certain experiences shift the interior architecture of a person, and you only notice the change when you try to go back to who you were before and find the door doesn't open the same way. So they've been looking for former assets from that operation, Mara said. Systematically, the woman said. You're not the first, and you may not be the last. Which is why we're recommending a change in your status. What kind of change? Active protective designation. It doesn't require you to return to operational work. It means you have a formal support structure, a secure housing assessment, and a response team on rotating standby. It also means we stop pretending that your civilian transition is invisible when it demonstrably isn't. Mara looked at the window of the room she'd borrowed for the call, a small conference room on the 3rd floor that Sandra had unlocked for her without asking what she needed it for. Through the window, she could see part of the hospital's east parking lot, and beyond it, a slice of Dunmore Street, the ordinary geography of a mid-sized city on a cloudy afternoon. And if I want to stay here, she said, if I want to keep this job? We're not asking you to leave, the woman said. We're asking you to let us do our job so you can do yours. Mara thought about the 12-page framework in the folder Odom had given her. The clinical liaison structure, the formal escalation pathway, the position description that described, in administrative language, the function she'd been performing informally for 7 months because she didn't know how to turn off the part of herself that noticed things. Okay, she said. That I can work with. The formal review board convened the following Tuesday. It was not a dramatic proceeding. Review boards rarely were. It was 4 people in a conference room with documents, and the conclusions they reached were thorough and unremarkable, in the way that conclusions are unremarkable when the evidence is unambiguous. Dr. Elliot Voss's 2 formal notices against Mara Calloway were officially struck from the record. The board's written finding noted that both notices had been filed in response to clinical actions that were subsequently validated by patient outcomes, and that the notices reflected a pattern of using administrative authority to suppress accurate clinical judgment rather than to correct clinical error. The finding also noted, in language that was careful and specific, that Dr. Voss had exercised his authority in a manner that created measurable patient safety risk, not through any single egregious act, but through the systematic reduction of a staff member's ability to advocate for patients. The finding recommended that this pattern be considered in any future credentialing decisions. Voss attended the board session. He sat through it with the expression of someone who had already done the internal accounting and knew the balance. He didn't argue the findings. He asked one question at the end: whether the board's record would affect his ability to practice medicine. The board chair told him that his clinical license was a separate matter from his administrative credentialing, and that the board's findings pertained to his exercise of department chief authority, not his competence as a physician. He nodded. He stood, gathered his folder, and left the room. He did not return to the department chief role. He accepted a staff physician position at a smaller facility in western Pennsylvania 3 months later, and by all accounts he was a careful and thorough emergency physician, which he had always been, and which had never been the point. The point was the other thing. The thing the board put in writing, which became part of the institutional record, which became part of the larger conversation the hospital started having about what it meant to be a place that claimed to protect patients, and then used its authority to silence the people most committed to that protection. It was not a clean ending for Voss. It was not a ruinous one either. It was the ending that fit the specific shape of what he had done. A man who wasn't corrupt, wasn't malicious, but who had let his authority become a wall he stood behind when he should have been standing behind something else. The board's record meant that wall was on file. That was the consequence. Not dramatic, just permanent. Sandra Oakes found Mara in the break room on a Thursday afternoon in late August, 6 weeks after the night everything changed. Mara was eating a sandwich, reading something on her phone, looking approximately as she always looked, present without being loud about it, existing in a space without requiring the space to acknowledge her. "How's the new role?" Sandra asked. "Different," Mara said. "Harder in some ways, easier in others." She'd taken the position. She'd also negotiated the terms of the active protective designation with the federal team, which had involved 2 more long calls and 1 in-person meeting that happened in a conference room that wasn't at Crestfield Regional and that she wasn't going to describe in detail to anyone. The outcome was functional: a support structure that didn't interfere with her work, a housing assessment that resulted in a change of apartment, and a check-in protocol that asked very little of her time but closed the gap that had existed without her knowing it. "The overnight staff say you're running the new training module next week," Sandra said. "First session," Mara said. "We'll see how it goes." "Joanna's signed up." "I know," Mara said. "She told me. She said she wanted to see if I was actually going to teach anything, or just make everyone feel inadequate by comparison." Sandra laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came out of relief as much as humor. "What are you going to teach them?" Mara put her phone down and thought about it. Not performing the consideration, actually thinking about it, the way she did things, all the way in. "How to pay attention," she said. Which sounds simple. It's not simple. Paying attention in a hospital means paying attention to the thing in front of you and the thing behind the thing in front of you and the system that produced both of them. It means not deciding what you're seeing before you've finished looking. It means staying in the room when the room is uncomfortable instead of letting the discomfort tell you what's safe to notice. Sandra looked at her. "That's not a training module," she said. "That's a philosophy." "Yeah," Mara said. "Turns out they're the same thing." Well said. The thing about Mara Calloway that the people at Crestfield Regional came to understand slowly, and that she never announced or explained, was that she had not come to that hospital to be saved. She had not come to be recognized or vindicated or placed in a position where the world could finally see what she was worth. She had come because she needed somewhere to put her hands while the rest of her figured out how to exist in a life that didn't have a mission at the center of it anymore. She had come because hospitals are places where people need things, and she was constitutionally incapable of being in a place where people needed things, and not trying to provide them. She had come because the part of her that had spent years in environments where one wrong decision meant someone didn't come home had not stopped running those calculations just because the environment changed. And a hospital floor at 3 in the morning, it turned out, was an environment where those calculations were useful every single shift. What she had not anticipated was that an institution could become a place worth fighting for. She'd spent enough years in environments defined by their willingness to discard people that she'd stopped expecting anything different. Crestfield Regional had done what institutions do. It had defaulted to protecting its hierarchy when someone inconvenient challenged it. That was not a surprise. What was a surprise was Sandra, who had asked the right questions instead of the safe ones, and Merck, who had made a decision in room 412 based on whether the person in front of her was worth trusting, rather than whether trusting her was procedurally comfortable. And Whitfield, who had nodded at her across the ER after the night it all moved, a 26-year-old resident's acknowledgement that was brief and sincere and cost him nothing and meant more than he probably knew. And Odom, who had started building the framework before he knew it was for her. None of it had been clean. That was the part she kept coming back to. The 2 formal notices were out of her file, but they had existed, and the 7 months of being positioned as a liability had been real, and the patient who had nearly died of a pulmonary embolism pending a discharge that Mara had flagged, and that had almost not been flagged in time. That near miss was part of the record too. The close call that institutional habit had nearly made inevitable. You didn't scrub the messy parts out of the record and call it justice. You kept them in and changed what you did next. That was the only version of justice that held up over time. Not erasure, not the clean reversal where everything that went wrong went right again. Just the honest accounting and then the decision about what to build on top of it. The first training session ran for 3 hours on a Wednesday morning in September. 14 nurses attended. Joanna sat in the second row with her arms crossed and her expression professionally neutral, which Mara had learned to read as engaged. A first-year nurse named Desta sat in the front row with a notebook and wrote things down with the intensity of someone who was trying to catch everything and knew she was going to miss some of it. A travel nurse named Rourke, who'd been on rotation for 2 months, asked 3 questions that were better than most of the questions Mara had expected. She taught them how to read a patient's vitals as a story rather than a number, how the sequence of changes mattered more than any individual data point, how the difference between a stable patient and a patient who was about to stop being stable was often visible in the 20 minutes before the monitors started alarming if you knew what you were looking for and had permission to trust what you saw. She taught them how to escalate without apologizing, how to document a concern in a way that couldn't be quietly buried, how to build a record that protected the patient and also protected themselves in an environment where their judgment was sometimes going to be challenged by people with more authority and less information. She didn't talk about herself. She didn't use examples from her own history. She used case studies that Odom's office had cleared, anonymized, stripped of identifying detail, real in their clinical substance. She let the cases do the teaching. But at the end of the 3 hours, Desta raised her hand and asked a question that wasn't about the case studies. "What do you do," Desta said, "when you're right about something and you have to prove it and you don't know if anyone is going to listen?" The room got quiet. The kind of quiet that meant everyone was listening to the answer and everyone had their own version of the question. Mara looked at her. Desta was young, 24, maybe 25. And she had the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hold back what it was thinking, which was going to be alternately an asset and a vulnerability throughout her career. "You document it," Mara said. "You document everything, every time, in language that can't be misread and can't be deleted. And then you do the thing anyway. Not the reckless version, not the version where you blow past the people around you and make yourself the story. You do it through every channel available to you, and when those channels don't work, you find the next one. And when that one doesn't work, you find the next one after that." "And if none of them work?" Desta said. "Some of them always work," Mara said. "Not fast, not in time to feel good in the moment. But the record is the thing. The record outlasts the room. The people who tried to bury your judgment don't get to decide what the record says. They only get to decide what they say to you directly. What you document is yours. Keep it." Desta wrote that down. Mara watched her write it, and thought about the 2 formal notices that were now out of her file and also permanently part of the story of this hospital, and what it meant that both things were true simultaneously. After the session, Joanna caught her near the door. "It was good," Joanna said. "Simple. No hedging." "First one," Mara said. "There'll be rough spots." "Sure," Joanna said. "There always are." She paused. "Desta's going to be excellent. 3 years from now, she's going to catch something on a shift that saves someone, and she's not going to know that this morning is part of why." "That's how it works," Mara said. "Yeah," Joanna said. "That's exactly how it works." On the last Friday of September, a card arrived at the nursing department addressed to the staff of the 4th floor. It was from Mrs. Halbrook's daughter. Inside was a photograph. Mrs. Halbrook on a hiking trail, green hills behind her, walking poles in both hands, her face tipped up at something above the frame. She looked tired and triumphant and completely alive. The card said simply, "She made it to the top. Thank you for making sure she could." Sandra put the photograph on the bulletin board outside the nursing station on 4, where it stayed for the rest of the year. A 70-year-old woman on a mountain, visible to anyone who walked past, unremarkable to most of them, the whole story invisible in the simple fact of her being there. Mara saw it on her way through one afternoon and stopped for a moment, just a moment, long enough to let it land. Then she kept walking. There were patients on the floor who needed things, and she was constitutionally incapable of being somewhere people needed things and not providing them. That had not changed. She did not think it was ever going to change, and she had stopped wanting it to. It was the truest thing she knew about herself, not the training, not the history, not the operational background that had made her capable of what she'd done on the night the helicopter landed on the roof. All of that was real, but none of it was the center. The center was this. She paid attention. She stayed in rooms that were uncomfortable. She kept the record. She did the thing. And when they told her she was just a nurse, when they put it in writing, filed it in triplicate, used it to move her to the overnight floor where she would be less visible and less inconvenient, she had gone to the overnight floor and done the work there instead. Because the work was the work regardless of what they called you while you did it. And the work, in the end, was the only argument that mattered.